Okami is one of my favorite games of all time. Unfortunately, it's also an incredibly underrated title that never got a proper sequel. When I say underrated, I don't mean its reception. It actually did quite well with its reception. I mean more in line with its sales. My first memory is renting it from Blockbuster on the PS2. There's a name you never thought you'd hear again. I remember how much I adored the game. Still do, in case I haven't made that abundantly clear already. So much attitude. Unfortunately, I never got to beat it until years later, when I actually bought it. When I finally did though, I remember how sad I was. Not because it sucked, but because it was over. What makes this game so good though? Let's find out, eh? The sun goddess Amaterasu, or Amy for short, who went by the nickname Shiranui, battled alongside the hero Nagi against a powerful 8-headed demonic dragon named Orochi, who gobbles up maiden sacrifices once a year like orange-flavored Tic Tacs. If there's any butchering of names, I do apologize. I'm doing my best to pronounce them correctly, but even my best is like, meh. Orochi is defeated, but in the process, Shiranui is mortally wounded, where she is then placed in stone. Fast forward 100 years later, and Amy is revived. The reason why she is revived in the first place is because she's the only one who can defeat Orochi, who was recently revived as well by some major league asshole. Orochi, doing what villains do best, covers Nippon, aka Okami's fictionalized version of Japan, in darkness. Amaterasu teams up with a small sprite-like creature named Isun, the Tit Dweller, and the two go on an epic adventure spanning across Nippon to recover Amaterasu's lost powers and repel the darkness away. The way she must do this is by reuniting with the 13 brush gods, who were all once a part of her, before she McDad, and those gods split apart from her, severely weakening her powers in the process. There's plenty of funny, engaging, and emotional moments that keep the plot intriguing throughout its 30-hour runtime. Even if there isn't any legitimate voice acting, aside from mumbling, the characters more than make up for it with their sheer expressiveness, personalities, and how well written they are. Much like Italians, they make exaggerated movements with their hands and faces. Amaterasu has no lines of dialogue at all, which is odd considering there are other dogs in the game who can speak and they're not even gods. Either way, while she doesn't speak outside of barking or growling, her actions dictate whether or not she cares. Just like your typical dog, she's super friendly, loving, loyal, and not above ripping an evil mofo's throat out for the people she cares about at a moment's notice. I wish she was my dog. I wouldn't have to worry about her living for only 12 years. Instead, she can watch me die at the ripe age of 130. Amy's favorite hobby is showing off her unusually large black butthole that will suck you in if you stare at it long enough. Seeing how Amy doesn't speak, Isun does all the talking for her. He can be annoying at times, and he's a bit of a dick. Yet, his dickness is what ends up providing solid comedic relief. He also has a tough love kind of approach as seen towards several characters, especially ones he deems as crybabies. However, that tough love helps shape those side characters into better, more independent individuals. My point being, unlike Navi, Isun is more than just an annoying little sprite whose sole purpose in life is violating your eardrums. Additionally, Amy and Isun do form a bond as the game progresses. So by the time they unwillingly part ways, you'll most likely end up feeling choked up. Even other supporting characters get the chance to shine. Susano is a middle-aged man who starts off as an extremely unlikable, lazy coward. Later on, he finally grows some hair on his balls and adopts a much more likable, heroic mindset. There's also Waka, not related to Pac-Man, disappointing, I know, a very peculiar individual whose allegiances are left open to interpretation for first-time players, until they reach a certain point in the story. Much like with Ada Wong, the mystery element, ironically, is what makes him one of the game's most interesting characters. Except he has much nicer hair, yet lacks her two greatest assets. The thing about cel-shaded games is they typically age like Paul Rudd. Okami is clearly no exception. The visuals are magnificent, yes, as they look like living, breathing watercolor paintings, which makes sense considering the game's developer Clover Studio was heavily inspired by Japanese watercolor and wood carving art for the game's visuals. Judging by these pictures, yeah, I'm gonna say they did a damn good job at replicating those styles. As pretty as the PS2 version looked, the HD version is so much cleaner, clear, and colorful looking. Aside from nostalgia, there's no other reason why you should play the PS2 version again. Not only does Okami look really good, but it sounds really good as well. Much like its protagonist, the soundtrack is divine. Dad joke central, y'all. I've always been a sucker for Japanese instruments. They have this peaceful, natural, earthy sound, if that makes any sense. Since the music is so good, it makes the game's most emotional moments that much more poignant. Despite obvious reskins, I'll give credit where it's due. There's a sizable amount of enemy variety, with many of the foes you go up against having innovative designs. And Okami's bestiary is one of the best bestiaries I've ever seen from an artistic standpoint. While I do enjoy the combat, it definitely feels a bit basic due to its difficulty, limited amount of melee moves you can execute, and being confined in a small force field with enemies. When I criticize the difficulty, I don't mean it's hard. This game suffers from the opposite problem. It's too damn fucking easy. So easy, in fact, you can go an entire playthrough without even dying once. As for the whole force field dilemma, you can escape from them. Still doesn't change the fact that it would have been better if you fought enemies in the actual world, much like in the Zelda series. Even worse, sometimes when you try escaping from these force fields, you end up targeting an enemy instead of the force field's weak point. Even so, combat still has some saving graces, like melee weapons known as divine instruments having 3 different categories you can choose from. Reflectors act as the most balanced form of melee weapons. Swords are slower but do a lot more damage. Finally, there's anal beads. These do less damage but make up for it with their faster attacks and much longer reach. Some divine instruments can be bought from merchants, while most of them are acquired from defeating bosses. Each newly required divine instrument has a huge damage boost compared to the previous one. The brush techniques is where combat is at its most interesting. You can essentially stop time, draw for example a line, and the enemy will be slashed. My personal favorite brush technique is the cherry bombs, as they are incredibly useful at ending combat encounters quickly. Upon coming into contact with enemies, the bomb will blow their asses up, turning them into kibbles and bits, and leaving nothing but yen rain in their wake. Certain enemies can only be defeated with certain brush techniques. For instance, sword-wielding enemies will block all your other attacks, meaning their guard can only be broken with a slash before they're left open for a beatdown. The whole brush mechanic is actually a really inventive concept. Quite literally, different strokes for different folks. Brush techniques aren't only used for combat, but exploration as well. Few of these brush techniques include Bloom, an ability that is used for restoring guardian saplings to their former state. Once this happens, the area is made fully explorable. This ability is also used for restoring other things that are flower related. Rejuvenation repairs broken objects, bridges included. Then there's Sunrise and Crescent. These turn night into day and day into night respectively. You can unlock new combat and traversal related moves by paying this sensei guy who can somehow flip his head upside down and not die. You learn things like attacking additional times with certain weapons. Golden Fury lets you piss on enemies who in turn expel demon fangs. More on those later. Holy Eagle lets you jump 2 times, reaching previously out-of-reach ledges, while Digging Champ lets you dig through tougher surfaces and uncover treasures or secret areas you couldn't before. The best thing to do while traversing Nippon, at least in my opinion, is running through the field maps, as I imagine it feels as freeing as Andy Dufresne did after he escaped from Shawshank. there are 3 major distinct biomes you'll come across. It may not seem like much, but each biome usually has several fairly large field maps. Some of these field maps even have villages or even a full-fledged city tucked away within them. Dungeons share the same basic premise as the one seen in Zelda. You obtain an item and use said item to defeat the dungeon boss lurking within. Except in Okami's case, it's brush techniques, and the dungeons have nowhere near the same level of intricacy as the one seen in Zelda. Most of them are downright basic as hell. You defeat an enemy, get a key, use the key to unlock a door, then repeat. There's very little puzzles within these dungeons. They're also incredibly short. Some later dungeons are improved, however, as they're longer and include more puzzles. Even then, this game isn't just easy in the combat aspect, but with its puzzle solving as well. I don't want puzzles to be hair ripping out kinda difficult. Not that I have much hair left to rip out anyway. Fortunately, this game's puzzles have incredibly easy solutions. As if the puzzles themselves weren't easy enough, they're made even easier with Isun beating you over the head with hints. I say hints, but they're really full-blown answers. In addition, fuck these roided brickmen. I bring them up because you fight several of them throughout the game. Defeating some of them is mandatory as they're inside dungeons. The only way you can defeat them is by memorizing their weak points. You have to hit the exact areas where their glowing weak points are. And I do mean exact in the most literal sense possible. If you draw a dot that is even slightly off from where the weak point actually is, you'll get pelted by falling rocks. The final dungeon is less like a dungeon and more like a boss gauntlet, where you fight several of the same bosses over again, including Orochi, who has already fought 2 times beforehand. If each battle with him was varied, then it wouldn't be a problem. Like, for example, when you fight Dark Samus multiple times in Metro Prime 2, at least she has new attacks and she becomes more and more difficult with every new fight you have with her. But with Orochi, not the case. As for the bosses themselves, unlike regular enemy encounters, or even Smitty small bosses, you aren't confined in a force field while fighting them. Bosses might look visually stunning, and the fights are fairly fun, though they are still way too easy to beat. However, I will say the final boss feels like a proper final boss. As a matter of fact, it is one of my favorite boss fights of all time. This game has a lot of entertaining side content you can sink your teeth into. In most cases, you are rewarded solid compensation for completing them. When you defeat marked monsters, you are rewarded with gold dust. This substance is used for upgrading weapons, even though gold dust can still be bought by certain merchants, albeit in limited quantities, or can even be acquired from treasure chests. My particular favorite side quest is fishing. In my experience, I think fishing is handled in this game better than it is in most games with optional fishing segments. Small fish, of course, will be caught quicker than I was whenever I played Grounders with my brother and sister. Bigger fish, on the other hand, will put up one hell of a fight. Caught fish can be sold to merchants, with the biggest ones selling for a pretty penny. Demon fangs are used for buying rare items called holy artifacts, like this one that lets you fast travel to certain save mirrors. Praise is earned by rejuvenating trees within each region, defeating demon gates, completing side quests, or feeding animals. When you gather enough praise, you can use it for upgrading things like health, how many ink pots you have, how much money you can hold in your wallet, and even the astral pouch, which will bring Amy back once her health is depleted. Although I doubt you'll ever need more than just the one astral pouch, seeing how, as I already mentioned, the game is ridiculously easy. Finally, there are like 100 of these beads you can uncover all across Nippon. When you find them all and then complete the game for the first time, you get a special reward. Imagine my disappointment when I beat the game and I found out it wasn't that kind of reward. When you beat the game, you can start a new playthrough with all your health and ink pod upgrades, along with just about every other weapon and holy artifact you acquired throughout your first playthrough intact. Moreover, you unlock karmic transformations, which is just a fancy way of saying skins. It is important to note, you can't keep all the brush techniques you acquired for obvious story-related reasons. All in all, plenty of motivation to play through the game again. Okami's combat and dungeons aren't its strongest suits, but Okami more than makes up for its faults with its impactful story, enticing characters, exploration, beautiful graphics, and wondrous soundtrack. This game deserves a sequel, and that DS game hardly counts. If the redundant piles of white dog shit known as Knack or Bubsy can get sequels, then why in the big-titted fuck can Okami?